what he's about to do in chapter 7 that we're going to look at is that he's so brilliant, he's going to anticipate this question, a really important question. And it's a question that if you've been a Christian for a while, you've definitely asked this question. And if you've been a Christian for just a second, you've probably asked this question. And if you're kicking the tires of this whole Jesus church thing, maybe you haven't asked the question, but I want to ask it tonight because I think it's a really important question. In this question that Paul's going to raise and then he's going to answer for us, lies this key or helps a real key to understanding how the Old Testament and the New Testament fit together. It's really key to saying, how do I follow Jesus? How do I grow in my faith? How do I stick to this thing that's by grace alone, through faith alone, in Christ alone? And how do I not get off track? And how do I not veer towards being overly religious? Or how do I not veer towards being rebellious? How do I not dip into pride or despair? But how do I grow to be more like Jesus? And so this is the way, starting in chapter 7, verse 1, he asks the question. Paul says, or do you not know, brothers? Okay, let's talk about something. There's probably something you've been thinking about, so let's talk about it. For I'm speaking to those who know the law. That the law is binding on a person only as long as he lives. So he's saying, I've been talking about grace and faith and Jesus, but what about the law? Like how does this whole grace, faith, Jesus thing fit in with the law and the commands of God? How do those things work together? And then he gives this illustration from marriage. Verse 2, he says, for a married woman is bound by law to her husband while he lives, but if her husband dies, she's released from the law of marriage. Accordingly, she'll be called an adulteress if she lives with another man while her husband is alive. But if her husband dies, she's free from that law. And if she marries another man, she's not an adulteress. Right? So Kristen and I are married, and as long as we're alive, we're bound to one another. But if I die, Kristen is free to marry. Now, if you try to marry her, I will haunt you in your darkest nights. So stay away, and I don't know why you'd ever want to marry anybody else, but except maybe after tonight, I don't know. But so then he kind of reposes the question. He says, likewise, my brothers, you also have died to the law through the body of Christ, so that you may belong to another, to him, Jesus, who has raised you from the dead, in order that we may bear fruit for God. For while we were living in the flesh, our sinful passions aroused by the law. Have you ever been driving down the road and you see the speed limit sign and it's like 65 and you're like, oh, that's just inviting me to do 75. Stop, that's step on pedal, right? Like we were in Maine a few years ago on a family vacation. All of Kristen's family was there, and we were in this beautiful little town, Keybunkport, Maine, and we're having lunch, and there's a little marina, and there's all these sailboats, and there's just like this beautiful little New England bridge, and it's this little drawbridge that goes over the bay, and we walk to the other side of it. All my nieces and nephews, Kristen's parents are there, and we're all standing around, and I turn back around, and on the side of the bridge is a big red button. And over the red button, it says, drawbridge opens. And then below it, it says, do not push button. And I look at the button, and I look at Kristen. Kristen's like, don't push the button. I'm like, but it says don't push the button. She's like, the drawbridge will go up. I'm like, I know. She's like, look, the alarm will sound. I'm like, I know. This is going to be great. My nieces and nephews are here. And I push the button. Drawbridge goes up, the alarm sounds, some guy comes out. Why did you push the button? I'm like, it said don't push the button. I had to push the button. And this is what Paul is saying. He's going, listen, You've got passions, you've got desires, and they're sort of woken up and stirred up inside of you when you see a law. He says, those were at work in our members to bear fruit for death. But now we are released from the law, having died to that which held us captive, so that we serve in the new way of the Spirit and not in the old way of the written code. What then shall we say? So here's Paul's question. He goes, okay, so Jesus came and he lived a perfect life. And he followed every single one of the laws. And he died under the law, under the penalty of the law for our sin. And then he was raised to new and everlasting life. And so, like Jesus died, when we place our faith and we place our trust in Jesus, we die to our sin. We die to the penalty of the law. And we're raised to a new life. We don't have to strive to earn God's good graces, his favor. We don't have to strive to fulfill the law in order to make God pleased with us and to accept us. We can put away all of the striving. All of that is done. We're in Jesus Christ. And Paul is just anticipating that as we hear about grace and we hear about faith and we hear about the gospel in Jesus Christ, that we would finally just go, okay, so if all that's true, what do I do with the law? Like, what's the role of the law in my life if I follow Jesus? I mean, do I not have to follow can I just lie when I want to lie now? Can I covet when I want to covet? Can I steal when I want to steal? Or maybe I'm under this new way of the Spirit, so now I can just sort of go where the Spirit tells me to go. I don't have to follow any written code. I don't have to follow any laws. I'm under the Spirit now. Or maybe did God change his mind? Like, was God all for the law at one point, and now after this Jesus thing, God has got this whole different system? And if God changed his mind, what if he changes it again? I love this. This ought to be really good news, what comes next in this passage. Paul shows us, he gives us an example of what it's like to look into that mirror. And he tells us what it's like to honestly, really look into the mirror and see the perfection of God and the sinfulness of my heart. And he says, here's what it's like. When you look in that mirror, here's what should stir up. Here's what I feel. This is what he says in verse 15. For I do not understand my own actions. Paul is probably the smartest man, aside from Jesus, to walk the face of the earth. He's brilliant. And he goes, I don't get it. I look at the law and I just don't get my own heart. He says, for I do not do what I want, but I do the very thing I hate. Now, if I do what I do not want, I agree that the law, that it's good. So now it's no longer I who do it, but it's sin that dwells within me. Now that's not like a get out of jail free card, all right? You're like, that's sin, that's not me. No, that's not what he's saying. For I know that nothing good dwells in me. I look in that mirror of the law and I just see a heart that is totally depraved. Not everything is bad, but everything is tainted by sin in my heart. When I look into that in the law, that is in my flesh. For I have the desire, come on, this is us, right? For I have the desire to do what is right, but not the ability to carry it out. Have you ever been there? 2 a.m. in the morning, Saturday. Hey, boo, what you doing? You're like, I don't want to do it, but my fingers just keep texting. Busy? You ever been in a meeting before? And you're like, keep your mouth shut. You ever do that? You ever walk into a meeting, you're like, all right, this is the day. Here I go. I'm not saying a word. I can go an hour, 60 minutes. I can do it, right? I'll just surf the web under the table. I won't say, and what do you make it 32 seconds? And you're like, no, wrong, no, I'm better, no. Then you walk out and you're like, I had the desire to do what was right. I just can't seem to control myself. I'm totally out of control. For I do not do the good I want, but the evil that I do not want is what I keep on doing. For if I do what I do not want, it's no longer I who do it, but it's sin that dwells within me. So I find it to be a law that when I want to do what is right, evil lies close at hand. For I delight in the law of God. In my inner being. He's actually quoting David out of Psalm 119. And David, do you remember the story of David? David would just write these amazing psalms. But he was a man that was so conflicted by his passions and by his desires. And God would say, even you who are conflicted by your passions and desires and can't seem to control your heart, you're a man after my own heart. He goes, I love the law of God, but I just can't keep from doing what I desire to do. But I see in my members another law waging war against the law of my mind and making me captive to the law of sin that dwells in my members. Guys, this is good news. That this is in the Bible should be super encouraging to us. Because here's the thing. If you are following after Jesus, if you're doing Christianity right, it feels like a war. It feels like a battle. Here's the thing, the battle is won. The battle's over. Jesus died and was raised to new and everlasting life. He conquered the battle. It's done, but it's like the landmines are still out there and the battle's over, but they're still pulling the old landmines up. Do you remember the story in Genesis chapter 1? The snake, 2, 3. You get a couple chapters into this really good story of the garden, and this snake shows up. And then the first gospel is preached. And says that one day there will come a snake crusher. That's Jesus. This snake that deceives and wages war on us. Jesus came, and it's like he took his boot and just stomped and crushed the head off the snake. Have you ever done that before? You ever cut the head off a snake before? Do you know what it does? It still squirms and riles around and makes a mess everywhere. That's what this is. The snake's head has been cut off. If you are a follower of Jesus, it's done, it's over. He won the battle, it's done. The war is over, but it still feels, you're feeling the aftershocks of it. And when you stare into the mirror of the law, you see the holy, righteous perfection of a good, great, glorious God. And then you see your own soul. And this is what he's saying. There's this divide that comes, this chasm, this gap. And as soon as Paul just pours out his heart about what it feels like to be caught in the middle, the very ends of the war being done, he then just, you can hear him. It's almost as if he just yells out, "Wretched man that I am." He looks at God's perfection, and then he looks at himself, and the only thing that he can do is he can just have this terribly wonderful confession of his sin. And it's painful. He's looking at it, and he's going, there is this gap between God and me. And I can't fill the gap. No amount of law keeping will ever fill the gap. No amount of rule keeping ever seems to fill the gap. And instead, whenever I go after the law, it just seems to drive a wedge further and further between me and God, doesn't it? Every rule you give yourself, you break your own rule, and you get more disappointed, and you go into more despair, or you keep them, and you get really puffed up with pride. And Paul just says, wretched man that I am. And then I love this. He says, who? Who will deliver me? You see that? He doesn't say, what can deliver me? He doesn't say, it's not my own law keeping. It's not the law of God. It's not following religion. It's not any of that that can deliver me. The law will never deliver you from sin. It will never fill the gap. It's not a what that fills a gap. But then he asks, but who? Who will deliver me? I need a deliverer. You need a deliverer. We need somebody to take us where we cannot go. Because, look what he says, who will deliver me from this body of death? Remember just last week in Romans 6:23, we read and it said, the wages of sin is death. Present tense. Sin has spiritually killed you and me. Our sin has spiritually killed our relationship with a perfect and holy God. And we cannot deliver ourselves from death. And law keeping can never bring a dead man back to life. Never. It doesn't matter how much you try. The law will never deliver you. It can't fill the gap. It can't make you alive.